You know someone like this, or maybe you are someone like this and haven't quite named it yet. The person who is always slightly performing, the one whose laugh is a little too well-timed, whose opinions arrive a little too polished, whose generosity feels a little too visible. You've watched them at parties, at work meetings, on social media. Everything they do is real technically. Nothing is staged in any obvious way, and yet there's a thin layer of presentation laid over every interaction, like a clear coat of paint that makes the whole thing feel almost true but never quite. If you've ever noticed yourself doing this, or noticed someone close to you doing this, and not understood where it comes from, there is a very specific psychology behind performative behavior. It isn't shallow, it isn't manipulation, it isn't vanity. It's almost always a survival strategy that started in childhood, became automatic by adolescence, and is now running the person's entire social life on a layer they don't consciously control. The performance isn't who they are, it's the protective coating over who they are. Here's the thing nobody talks about. Children are not born performative. They are born expressive. They cry when they're sad. They laugh when they're happy. They tell you exactly what they think with no editing. In between the thinking and the saying, watch any 2-year-old for 10 minutes. There is no performance there. There is just direct, unfiltered self. What turns expression into performance is feedback. Specifically, the slow accumulating feedback that some parts of the child's self are welcomed and other parts are not. The bright, cheerful version gets praise. The sad, messy version gets ignored or punished. The agreeable version gets love. The disagreeable version gets distance. Over years, the child learns which version of themselves keeps them connected to the people they need, and they learn to lead with that version every time. By adolescence, the leading with it is automatic. By adulthood, it's so reflexive the person no longer knows they're doing it. The performance has become the only version of themselves they remember how to be. In 1960, British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott published one of the most influential papers in modern psychology on what he called the true self and the false self. Winnicott observed that when a child's natural emotional expression isn't reliably met by caregivers, the child develops a false self, a constructed presentation built to win the love that the true self couldn't reliably get. The false self isn't a lie. The child usually believes in it. It is a performance. In the technical sense, a version of the self optimized for being received well rather than for being accurate. More recent research by Mark Snyder, beginning in the 1970s, formalized this into what he called self-monitoring. High self-monitors are people whose social behavior is constantly being adjusted based on what they think the room wants from them. They're often described by others as charming and socially skilled. Internally, they report a quiet, permanent exhaustion they don't know how to name. Snyder's research found high self-monitors disproportionately came from childhoods where conditional approval was the main currency of love. Performance, in other words, is not a personality type. It's an attachment adaptation. Picture 2 scenes at the same dinner party. In the first, you're watching someone across the table. They've laughed at 3 jokes in a row that weren't quite that funny. They're nodding along to a story they clearly disagree with. They're saying things that sound right but feel slightly too prepared. You can't put your finger on what's off, but something is. You walk away, mildly unsettled by them, and not sure why. In the second scene, you are the person across the table. You are aware, dimly, of selecting the right facial expression for each moment. You are aware of editing your story before you tell it. You are aware that the version of you sitting at this table is a version you'd be exhausted to maintain alone, and that you have been maintaining it for as long as you can remember. You walk away tired in a way that has nothing to do with the conversation and everything to do with the work of producing the version of you that showed up. But here's where it gets interesting. The performative person is not faking the warmth, the interest, the kindness. Those are usually real impulses. What's being added on top is a layer of presentation, of slight amplification, designed to make sure the warmth lands, the interest registers, the kindness gets noticed. That extra layer is the false self at work. The underlying warmth is real. The performance is wrapped around it to ensure it gets received. But there's more going on. The performative person is almost always running on a kind of permanent low-grade anxiety the people around them never see. The anxiety is about being seen accurately. If the true self showed up unedited, would it be welcomed? The false self exists precisely because at some point in childhood, the answer came back no, Now it runs by default, every interaction, every day. And here's the kicker. The cultural framing of performative behavior has been almost entirely contemptuous. The performer gets called fake, shallow, attention-seeking, vain. Those framings are almost never accurate to the underlying psychology. They're the social reflex of people who correctly sense something is off, but who incorrectly conclude the offness is moral rather than developmental. The performative person isn't a worse person than you. They're usually someone whose early life taught them being seen accurately was dangerous, and whose adult social system is still running protection for a wound nobody has helped them name. And this shows up in ways you might not notice. The performative person is often the most tired person in the room, even when they look the most polished. The version people are praising isn't the version they live inside, which means every compliment lands on the wrong target. The praise reinforces the false self, which deepens the gap between the seen self and the real one. The performance is a trap that builds itself out of every successful execution of itself. Now let's be honest. There is a separate version of this that doesn't fit the reframe. Some people use performance as deliberate social currency, knowingly, strategically, to extract things from people who trust them. That isn't the false self protecting itself. That's manipulation, and it deserves a different conversation. The reframe in this video applies to the much larger population of people whose performance is unconscious, defensive, and exhausting to maintain. The protective version is worth compassion. The deliberate version is worth your attention, but not your benefit of the doubt. But for the people who recognize themselves in this, or who recognize someone they love, here's what's happening. The performance isn't a character flaw. It's an unmet developmental need that learned to wear a smile. The person underneath the performance is real, and is usually exhausted, and is usually waiting, often without knowing they're waiting, for an environment safe enough to let the true self show up without being managed. The work isn't to call the performance out. The work is to recognize that the performance is itself a kind of report. For the people watching someone like this from the outside, the most useful thing you can do is not name the performance. The most useful thing is to be one of the people in their life who doesn't visibly require it. The true self emerges in environments where it stops costing something to show up. There's something quietly sad about how this pattern operates. The person you've been mildly suspicious of, or quietly annoyed by, or unable to fully trust, is very likely a person who learned somewhere early on that the unedited version of themselves wasn't safe to bring into the room. They are, in their adult life, running the same protective program that kept them connected as a child, even though the room is different now. Nobody told the program to update. If you have noticed any of this in yourself, this might be the moment to consider that the performance isn't who you are. It's what you learn to do to make sure who you are could stay alive somewhere underneath. The true self is still there. It's been waiting. You're not fake. You're not vain. You're not shallow. You're someone whose nervous system learned early that being seen accurately wasn't safe, and the performance is the protection that kept the true self intact long enough for you to find this video. Silent awareness exists to name the quietly different ways your mind works, the patterns nobody else seems to talk about with any accuracy. If that's the kind of channel you want more of, subscribe. The next one lands soon, and the project only continues because people who recognize themselves here choose to stick around.